1 Intro. What if I told you the strongest person in the room isn't the loudest, or the coldest, but the one who refuses to react? Imagine someone insults you, betrays you, pushes your limits, and you don't shatter. Not because you feel nothing, but because you've trained one mental habit most people ignore. In the next few minutes, I'll show you what Marcus Aurelius understood about emotional power, and why mastering it makes you impossible to break. If you value timeless strength and inner control, subscribe to Legacy of Thinkers now. Let's begin. To the problem: emotional reactivity. Most people believe emotional strength means controlling how they feel, so they try to suppress anger, hide disappointment, and silence fear. But that's not strength. That's pressure building beneath the surface. Emotional reactivity doesn't begin with the emotion itself. It begins with how quickly we attach meaning to it. Someone sends a sharp email. Immediately, your mind says, "They don't respect me." A friend cancels plans. Your thoughts whisper, "I'm not important." In seconds, the story becomes bigger than the event. We don't just feel pain, we amplify it. We replay conversations in our heads, adding tone that wasn't there, intention that was never confirmed. The body tightens, the heartbeat rises, and before we even notice it, we've reacted. A defensive message, a cold reply, a silent withdrawal. The moment passes, but the damage lingers. Emotional reactivity makes us fragile because it hands control to whatever triggers us. If your peace depends on how others behave, you will always be at the mercy of someone else's mood, opinion, or timing. The problem is not that we feel anger, embarrassment, or disappointment. The problem is that we confuse the first emotional spark with truth. We assume our initial reaction is reality. And the more we react without awareness, the more we strengthen that habit. It becomes automatic. Someone criticizes you, and you instantly shrink or attack. Someone ignores you, and you instantly question your worth. Over time, this pattern shapes identity. You start believing you are your reactions. But emotional reactivity is not power. It is surrender disguised as honesty. It feels authentic because it is immediate, yet it is also impulsive, unexamined, and often inaccurate. The Stoics understood something most of us overlook. The first emotion is human. The immediate reaction is optional. Until we recognize this distinction, we remain easily shaken. Not because the world is cruel, but because we have not trained the space between what happens and what we decide it means. 3. The Stoic Shift. Marcus' teaching. Marcus Aurelius did not live in a peaceful world. He ruled during war, plague, betrayal, and political unrest. He was surrounded by chaos, criticism, and constant pressure. Yet in his private writings, he rarely complained about other people. Instead, he kept returning to one radical idea: it is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them. That shift changes everything. Marcus never tried to eliminate emotion. He understood that anger, fear, and disappointment arise naturally. What he trained was the moment after the emotion appeared. The instant the mind begins to interpret, he would pause and ask himself, "Is this within my control? Or am I reacting to a story I just created?" This is the Stoic shift. It is not about becoming cold or detached. It is about separating the raw event from the meaning you assign to it. Someone insults you. The insult is real, but the belief that it diminishes your worth, that is interpretation. A plan fails. The failure is real, but the conclusion that you are incapable, that is judgment layered on top. Marcus practiced seeing events as neutral occurrences. A sound, a sentence, a delay, a mistake, nothing more. The suffering came later, when the mind rushed to label it unfair, disrespectful, catastrophic. In his view, the mind is both the battlefield and the refuge. If you discipline your judgments, you protect your inner world. If you allow every impression to become truth, you surrender your stability. He wrote reminders to himself, not because he was naturally calm, but because he understood how easily the mind drifts toward exaggeration. The Stoic shift is subtle but powerful. You are not required to agree with your first thought. You are not obligated to believe every interpretation your mind offers. Between the stimulus and your conclusion, there is a brief, quiet space. Marcus trained himself to stand there. That space is where freedom begins. Not the freedom to control the world, but the freedom to control what the world means to you. For the one mental habit. The one mental habit that makes you impossible to break is deceptively simple. Train the space between stimulus and response. Not eliminate emotion. Not suppress reaction. Train the space. Every trigger follows a pattern. First, something happens. A comment, a delay, a tone of voice. Then, almost instantly, your nervous system activates. Heat rises. The chest tightens. Thoughts rush in to explain what just occurred. That explanation feels automatic, almost unquestionable. But this is the critical moment, the space most people ignore. The habit is to slow that moment down. When something provokes you, instead of reacting outwardly or collapsing inwardly, you ask 3 quiet questions. First, what actually happened? Without interpretation? Strip it down to observable facts. Not, they disrespected me, but they raised their voice. Not, I failed, but the project didn't succeed. Second, what story am I adding? This is where ego, fear, and insecurity often enter. We assume intention. We predict outcomes. We attach identity. The Stoic habit is to notice the narrative forming and recognize that it is optional. Third, who do I choose to be in this moment? This is where power returns. You are no longer reacting from impulse. You are responding from identity. Calm, steady, principled. Training this space does not mean you won't feel anger or disappointment. It means those emotions do not own your behavior. You still feel the spark, but you do not let it spread into a wildfire. You create a gap wide enough to think clearly. Over time, this gap becomes natural. What once took 10 seconds may take only 1 breath. That breath changes everything. It interrupts escalation. It prevents regret. It preserves dignity. The world will continue to provoke you. People will misunderstand you. Plans will fail. But if you master this one habit, if you consistently return to the space between what happens and what you choose, you become difficult to destabilize. Not because life is easy, but because your response is deliberate. And deliberate responses are far harder to break than impulsive reactions. 5 modern application, Ava and Daniel arc. Daniel used to react before he even realized he was reacting. One sharp email from his boss and his entire mood would shift. His jaw tightened. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. He didn't pause to clarify. He defended. He justified. Sometimes he escalated. Later, he would reread the exchange and feel that quiet sting of regret. Not because he was wrong, but because he had given the moment more power than it deserved. Ava's pattern was different, but just as costly. When someone criticized her, she didn't explode. She internalized. A casual comment about her work would echo in her mind for hours. She replayed the tone, the facial expression, the imagined intention behind it. Outwardly calm, inwardly unraveling. Her reaction wasn't loud, but it shaped her confidence in ways she didn't notice. Both of them believed they were simply being honest with their feelings. But honesty without awareness is just impulse with a better name. Then they began practicing the space. The next time Daniel received a harsh message, he felt the familiar surge, heat in his chest, urgency in his thoughts, but instead of replying immediately, he leaned back. 1 breath, 2 breaths. He asked himself, what actually happened? The answer was simple. He criticized the proposal, not, he thinks I'm incompetent. The difference was subtle, but powerful. He waited 10 minutes before responding. When he did, his tone was measured, clear, professional. The outcome changed. Ava tried the same practice. A colleague questioned her idea during a meeting. The old pattern would have turned that moment into self-doubt. But she paused. What are the facts? He disagreed with the approach. Not, he thinks I'm incapable. She noticed the story forming, and let it dissolve. Instead of shrinking, she asked a calm follow-up question. The room responded differently to her steadiness. Nothing dramatic happened. No applause. No cinematic breakthrough. But something quieter shifted. They no longer felt owned by every impression. Their emotions still arrived, but they no longer dictated behavior. In small, repeated moments, Daniel became less defensive. Ava became less self-critical. Not because life softened, but because they stopped surrendering the space between trigger and choice. That space changed their posture, their tone, their presence, and over time, it changed how others treated them. 2. 6. Why this makes you unbreakable. This is what makes you unbreakable. Not the absence of pain, not the disappearance of conflict, but the refusal to let every emotion decide your next move. When you train the space between stimulus and response, you stop living at the mercy of the moment. You still feel disappointment, you still feel anger, you still feel fear, but those feelings no longer steer your behavior automatically. They inform you, without controlling you. Most people think strength means becoming harder, less sensitive, less affected, but real resilience is not emotional numbness. It is emotional governance, the ability to experience a surge of feeling without surrendering your direction. When someone criticizes you and you pause before reacting, you reclaim authority over your identity. When a plan collapses and you choose clarity instead of self-blame, you preserve stability. When a relationship becomes tense and you respond thoughtfully instead of impulsively, you interrupt cycles that would otherwise repeat for years. Unbreakable people are not untouched by life. They are simply less reactive to its fluctuations. They understand that events are temporary, but impulsive reactions can have permanent consequences. Marcus faced betrayal within his own circle. He faced disease sweeping through his empire. He faced the uncertainty of war. None of these spared him from stress, but he trained himself to focus on what remained within his control, his judgments, his choices, his character. That focus creates an internal anchor. When you are anchored internally, external turbulence loses its power. The insult still lands, but it does not define you. The setback still stings, but it does not collapse your confidence. The delay still frustrates, but it does not erode your composure. Over time, something subtle shifts. You begin to trust yourself, not because nothing challenges you, but because you know you will not abandon your principles when challenged. That is what makes you difficult to break. You are no longer fragile in the face of unpredictability. You are deliberate, measured, grounded. Your reactions are no longer reflexes, they are decisions. And decisions, made with awareness and intention, are far stronger than impulses driven by emotion. 7. Closing impact. Identity shift ending. At the end of the day, the world will not stop testing you. People will misunderstand you. Plans will fall apart. Emotions will rise without permission. That will never change. What can change is who you become in those moments. You are not your first reaction. You are not the surge of anger, the rush of embarrassment, or the wave of fear. Those are signals. They are human, but they are not your identity. Your identity is built in the pause. Every time you choose clarity over impulse, you strengthen something invisible. Every time you respond with intention instead of reacting from ego, you reshape who you are. And slowly, almost quietly, you become someone steadier, harder to shake, more grounded than before. Being unbreakable does not mean life stops hurting. It means pain no longer dictates your character. It means your peace is no longer rented out to every passing opinion or circumstance. That is the shift, not control over the world, but mastery over yourself. If this message resonated with you, share it with someone who needs steadiness in their life. Leave a comment and tell me, what is one situation where you will practice the pause? Like this video if you believe strength begins within. And subscribe to Legacy of Thinkers for more timeless wisdom that helps you grow stronger, calmer, and harder to break. Your next reaction could change your life.